Love can bloom in the most unexpected places, even when wrapped in armor and pride. When Lady Eira challenges any man to tame her wild stallion, she never expects it to change her heart forever. The sharp-tongued daughter of a warlord makes this bold declaration, thinking no one can succeed. Knights and lords try and fail, thrown by the fierce black horse. Then a quiet knight appears with no name and worn armor. He doesn't fight the stallion. He simply touches its side, and the horse becomes calm. Everyone watches in shock as this stranger does the impossible. But this mysterious knight has a secret, and her laughter is the first thing in years that makes him feel alive again. What drives him to seek her hand, and why does their meeting feel like destiny? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the battlements of Castle Ravenshollow like the memories that haunted its corridors. Lady Eira stood at her chamber window, her fingers absently turning the iron bracelet that encircled her wrist, a gift from her father. On her 16th birthday, forged from the same metal as the castle's gates. It was beautiful in its simplicity, but she often wondered if it represented more than paternal affection. Perhaps it was a reminder of the chains that bound her to duty, to expectation, to a future she had not chosen for herself. The kingdom of Aldermere stretched beyond the castle walls, a patchwork of green fields and stone villages connected by winding roads that had seen too much war in recent years. From her tower window, Eira could see the practice yards where her father's men trained, their wooden swords clacking in rhythmic patterns that had become the soundtrack of her youth. The sound brought her comfort and unease in equal measure. Comfort, because it meant safety; unease, because it reminded her that safety came at a price. "My lady," came a gentle voice from behind her. Marin, her lady-in-waiting and closest friend, entered carrying a breakfast tray. At 22, Marin was only 3 years older than Eira, but possessed a wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her years. Her brown hair was braided simply, and her dress was practical rather than ornate, a reflection of her personality. "Your father requests your presence in the great hall after you've broken your fast." Eira turned from the window, her green eyes reflecting a mixture of resignation and rebellion that had become familiar to those who knew her well. "Let me guess, another suitor has arrived, bearing gifts and grand promises about the prosperity our union would bring to both our houses." Marin set the tray down carefully on the wooden table near the window. Steam rose from the porridge, and fresh bread sat beside a small pot of honey simple fare that Eira preferred to the elaborate meals served in the great hall. "Actually, no suitors today, but there is talk of the harvest festival preparations, and your father values your input on the arrangements." "My input," Eira repeated with a slight smile. "Or my compliance?" "Perhaps both," Marin admitted, returning the smile. "But you know he listens to you more than he admits. Your ideas for last year's festival brought merchants from 3 neighboring kingdoms." Eira sat at the table and broke off a piece of bread, her movements deliberate and graceful despite her informal setting. She had learned early that every gesture was watched, every word weighed for its political implications. Sometimes she envied Marin, the freedom to speak without considering how her words might affect trade agreements or military alliances. "Tell me honestly, Marin," Eira said, dipping the bread in honey. "Do you think I'm being foolish? Resisting marriage, I mean. Father grows more concerned with each passing season, and I know the neighboring lords whisper that I'm becoming too old to be an advantageous match." Marin sat across from her, a privilege that spoke to their long friendship. In the formal hierarchy of the castle, a lady-in-waiting would stand while her mistress ate. But Eira had long ago insisted on treating Marin as a sister rather than a servant. "I think," Marin said carefully, "that you're waiting for something your father's generation doesn't understand. They married for alliance, for duty, for the strengthening of borders and the flow of trade. But you want what your mother had with Lord Gareth before duty hardened his heart. The mention of her mother brought a familiar ache to Eira's chest. Lady Isabel had died 5 years ago, not from any dramatic battlefield wound or political assassination, but from a broken heart that had slowly consumed her after her beloved brother fell in battle. Eira remembered her mother's laughter, the way her eyes would light up when Lord Gareth entered a room, the gentle songs she would sing while brushing Eira's hair. That kind of love seemed like a luxury her generation could not afford. Mother's love story was different, Eira said quietly. She and father fell in love before politics demanded their marriage. I don't have that luxury. Every man who seeks my hand sees either my father's wealth or my potential as a broodmare for his heirs. Perhaps, Marin said gently, but that doesn't mean love cannot grow from other beginnings. Many couples learn to care for each other deeply, even if they don't start with the passion of young romance. Eira finished her breakfast in contemplative silence, then rose to prepare for the day. Her morning routine was both practical and defiant. She insisted on dressing simply, favoring riding clothes over elaborate gowns whenever possible. Today she chose a deep blue dress that was well made but not ostentatious, with sleeves that allowed for freedom of movement. Over it she fastened a leather belt that held a small dagger, a practical necessity that also served as a subtle reminder to potential suitors that she was not a delicate flower to be plucked. The great hall of Castle Ravenshollow was a testament to both power and practicality. Massive stone pillars supported a vaulted ceiling, and tapestries depicting the family's heraldry, a silver wolf on a field of deep green hung from the walls. The morning light streamed through high windows, casting long shadows across the rush-covered floors. At the far end of the hall, Lord Gareth sat in his carved oak chair, reviewing documents with his steward. At 48, Lord Gareth remained an imposing figure despite the gray that had begun to thread through his dark hair. His face bore the lines of a man who had made difficult decisions and lived with their consequences. When he looked up at Eira's approach, his expression softened with genuine affection, one of the few times his political mask slipped completely. "Daughter," he said, rising to embrace her. "I trust you slept well?" "Well enough, father. Marin tells me you wish to discuss the harvest festival." Lord Gareth gestured for her to sit in the chair beside her mother's chair, which had remained empty for 5 years, except when Eira occupied it. "Among other things, yes. But first, I wanted to speak with you about Sir Marcus of Westhold. He sent word yesterday requesting permission to court you formally." Eira's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Sir Marcus was the third son of a minor lord, ambitious and reasonably handsome, but possessed of an arrogance that grated against her sensibilities. During his last visit, he had spent more time examining the castle's defenses and questioning the steward about grain yields than attempting to know her as a person. "And what did you tell him, father?" "That the decision would be yours, as always." "But Eira, you must understand winter approaches, and with it the season when young men's thoughts turn to marriage contracts and spring weddings. If you continue to refuse every suitor, people will begin to question whether you're capable of fulfilling your duty to our house." The words stung because they carried truth. Eira understood the delicate balance of power that kept their kingdom stable, the way marriage alliances strengthened borders and secured trade routes. But understanding duty and embracing it wholeheartedly were different matters entirely. "Perhaps," she said, a note of defiance creeping into her voice, "I should make a public declaration. Announce that I'll marry the first man who can accomplish some impossible task. That would solve the problem of constant suitors while ensuring that none actually succeed." Lord Gareth raised an eyebrow, recognizing the tone that had preceded many of his daughter's more memorable rebellions. "What sort of impossible task did you have in mind?" Eira's eyes moved to the great hearth, where her mother's portrait hung in a place of honor. In the painting, Lady Isabel stood beside a magnificent black stallion, her hand resting gently on its neck. The horse had been her pride and joy, a wedding gift from Gareth that had produced a lineage of exceptional war horses. "The stallion," Eira said suddenly. "Shadowmere, Mother's stallion. He's been unrideable since she died, violent with anyone who approaches. I could declare that I'll marry any man who can tame him." The suggestion hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down before God and witnesses. Lord Gareth studied his daughter's face, reading the complex mixture of pain, defiance, and desperate hope that flickered in her green eyes. Shadowmere had been Lady Isabel's constant companion, a coal-black stallion with intelligence in his dark eyes and power in every line of his body. Since her death, he had become increasingly wild, striking out at grooms, refusing bridle and saddle, as if grief had driven him beyond the reach of human kindness. Several of the castle's best horsemen had attempted to break him, resulting in broken bones and wounded pride. "That would indeed be impossible," Lord Gareth said slowly. "And public declarations have a way of taking on lives of their own. You couldn't simply retract such a challenge if it proved inconvenient." "I know," Eira replied, meeting her father's gaze steadily. "But it would give me time, Father. Time to find some other solution, or perhaps time for the political situation to change. And if, by some miracle, a man does manage to tame Shadowmere well, perhaps that would tell us something important about his character." Lord Gareth was quiet for a long moment, considering not just his daughter's words, but the woman she had become. Eira possessed her mother's beauty and grace, but also a steel core that reminded him of his own youth. She would make a formidable ally and a dangerous enemy, regardless of whom she eventually married. "Very well," he said finally, "but understand the conditions. If you make this challenge publicly, you will be bound by honor to accept the outcome. And the man who succeeds, whoever he might be, will have demonstrated not just skill with horses, but the kind of courage and determination that makes a good husband and ally." Eira felt a mixture of relief and terror at her father's agreement. She had expected him to dismiss the idea as foolish, but his acceptance made it real, binding, dangerous. Still, the alternative, a parade of calculating suitors assessing her value like livestock at market, seemed worse than any risk her challenge might bring. "Then we are agreed, Father. At the harvest festival, before all the gathered nobility, I will make my declaration." As they spoke, neither father nor daughter noticed a figure watching from the shadows of the gallery above, a cloaked traveler who had arrived with the dawn, seeking shelter and information, his steel-gray eyes fixed on Lady Eira with an intensity that would have unnerved her had she seen it, and his weathered hands clenched unconsciously as he listened to her challenge. The stranger had come to Castle Ravenshollow for reasons he could not yet voice, driven by guilt and a need for redemption that had carried him across half the kingdom. He had not expected to find hope in the voice of a young woman defending her right to choose her own fate. But as he listened to her courage in the face of duty's demands, something long dormant stirred in his chest, something that felt dangerously like purpose. The harvest festival dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden autumn light that made even the castle's weathered stones look magnificent. Banners fluttered from every tower, and the courtyard buzzed with activity as merchants arranged their wares and servants prepared tables for the evening feast. The air carried the scent of roasting meat, fresh bread, and the last apples of the season. Eira stood before her mirror, allowing Marin to arrange her hair in an intricate braid woven with ribbons of silver and green, her family's colors. Her dress was her finest, a deep emerald silk that brought out her eyes, but her expression was troubled. The reality of what she was about to do had settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "You don't have to go through with this," Marin said softly, securing the final ribbon. "You could simply tell your father you've reconsidered." "No," Eira replied, though her voice carried less conviction than her words. "I made a choice, and I'll see it through. Besides, it's impossible. No one will be able to tame Shadowmere. This will buy me time, nothing more." But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her. What if someone did succeed? What if her desperate gamble backfired and she found herself bound to a stranger whose only qualification was skill with an untamable horse? The great hall filled quickly as the morning progressed. Lords and ladies from across the region had come for the festival, bringing their sons and daughters, their hopes and their political calculations. Eira recognized most of the faces. Sir Marcus of Westhold, looking confident, well-groomed. Lord Edmund's eldest son, whose hand shook slightly from too much wine despite the early hour. The twin brothers from House Ashford, both competent fighters but lacking in imagination. When the horn sounded to call the assembly to order, Eira took her place beside her father's chair. Lord Gareth rose, his voice carrying easily across the crowded hall. "Friends, neighbors, honored guests," he began. "We gathered today to celebrate another successful harvest and to strengthen the bonds between our houses. But before we turn to celebration, my daughter has an announcement to make." The hall quieted, conversations dying as all eyes turned to Eira. She rose slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and stepped forward. There was no turning back. "Now, noble lords and gallant knights," she said, her voice clear despite her inner turmoil, "I am grateful for the honor many of you have shown in seeking my hand, but I find myself in need of a different kind of proof than traditional courtship provides." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was not the usual script for such announcements. "In my mother's memory, I make this declaration. I will marry the man who can tame Shadowmere, the black stallion that was her beloved companion. The horse has been wild since her death, accepting no rider, trusting no handler. The man who can earn his trust and ride him safely will prove himself worthy of my hand and my father's blessing." The hall erupted in surprise conversation. Some lords looked intrigued, others calculating, a few openly skeptical. Eira caught sight of Sir Marcus, whose confident expression had shifted to one of concern. Clearly, he had not expected this development. "Furthermore," Eira continued, raising her voice above the murmur, "I will make this trial today, before all assembled, so that there can be no question of the outcome. Any man who wishes to attempt the challenge may do so." Lord Gareth stood and placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, a gesture of support that carried its own message. "Let it be known that Lady Eira's challenge is made with my full blessing. Any man who succeeds will have my approval for the match, regardless of his station or holdings." The last phrase was significant. It meant that even a landless knight could compete, a detail that widened the field considerably and caused another stir among the assembled nobility. The crowd moved to the castle's main courtyard, where a circular area had been roped off for various festival competitions. Grooms brought Shadowmere from the stables, and gasps rose from those who had never seen the magnificent animal. He was larger than most war horses, his coat so black it seemed to absorb light, his neck arched proudly despite the obvious tension in his body. His eyes rolled wide as he surveyed the crowd, and he danced sideways, powerful muscles bunching and releasing under his sleek coat. Sir Marcus stepped forward first, his jaw set with determination. He was an experienced horseman, Eira knew, and had probably spent considerable time preparing for this moment since word of the challenge had spread. "I claim the right of first attempt," he announced, stripping off his doublet to reveal a fine linen shirt. "As Lady Eira's most persistent suitor, I should have precedence." No one disputed his claim, though Eira noticed several other young men exchanging glances that promised their own attempts would follow. Sir Marcus approached the stallion confidently, speaking in low, soothing tones. Shadowmere's ears flicked forward momentarily, as if listening, before pinning back against his skull. The horse's reaction was swift and violent. As Sir Marcus reached for the halter rope, Shadowmere reared, his front hooves slashing the air inches from the man's face. Sir Marcus stumbled backward, his confidence evaporating as the stallion screamed a challenge that echoed off the courtyard. Walls. Two more attempts followed in quick succession. Lord Edmund's son tried a different approach, offering the horse apples and speaking gently, but Shadowmere struck out with his hind legs, barely missing the young man's ribs. The elder Ashford twin attempted to assert dominance through sheer force of will, approaching with a firm hand and commanding voice, only to find himself flat on his back in the dirt as the stallion wheeled away from his touch. Each failure seemed to make Shadowmere more agitated, more dangerous. His nostrils flared red, and foam began to gather at the corners of his mouth. Several of the watching ladies stepped back involuntarily, and even some of the knights looked uncertain about proceeding. It was then that the stranger appeared. He came not from the crowd of assembled nobility, but from the direction of the stables, as if he had been watching from the shadows and only now decided to act. He was tall but not imposing, broad-shouldered but not bulky, with the lean build of a man accustomed to long days in the saddle. His clothes were well made but worn, the kind of practical garments favored by soldiers and travelers. His dark hair was touched with premature gray at the temples, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent years under foreign suns. But it was his eyes that caught Eira's attention, steel gray eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience she could not fathom. They were eyes that had seen death and beauty, triumph and loss, and had somehow found peace with all of it. The stranger carried a pair of worn leather gauntlets in his hands, the kind used by cavalrymen for better grip on reins and weapons. The leather was scarred and stained, speaking of countless battles and long campaigns. But there was something else about them, something that suggested they had been crafted with care and worn with pride. "By your leave, my lord," the stranger said, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard despite its quiet tone. "I would attempt your daughter's challenge." Lord Gareth studied the newcomer with the eye of a man who had commanded soldiers and could recognize a warrior when he saw one. "You may try, sir, though I warn you, the horse has grown more dangerous with each attempt. What is your name, that we might know who risks his life for my daughter's hand?" The stranger hesitated for just a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I am a knight in service to no lord, seeking only the chance to prove my worth. If I succeed, names will matter. If I fail, they will not." It was an evasive answer, but delivered with such quiet dignity that no one pressed for more details. Eira found herself studying the man's face, trying to read the story written in its lines. There was sadness there, she thought, but also a kind of weary determination that intrigued her. The stranger pulled on his gauntlets with practiced ease, then walked toward Shadowmere with none of the hesitation or bravado that had marked the previous attempts. The horse watched his approach, ears forward but body still tense, as if trying to decide whether this new human represented threat or opportunity. What happened next would be discussed and debated in the halls of Castle Ravenshollow for years to come. The stranger did not try to grab the stallion's halter or assert dominance through force. Instead, he simply stood within arm's reach of the great horse and waited. His posture was relaxed but alert, his hands visible but non-threatening. Shadowmere snorted and pawed the ground, clearly agitated but no longer actively aggressive. The stranger began to speak, his voice too low for the watching crowd to hear. The words, but the tone was unmistakably gentle, almost conversational. It was as if he were sharing a confidence with an old friend. Slowly, incredibly, the stallion's posture began to change. His ears, which had been pinned back in anger or fear, gradually moved forward. His neck, which had been arched in challenge, lowered slightly. The The wild look in his dark eyes softened to something that looked almost like recognition. When the stranger finally moved, it was with the same deliberate calm he had shown throughout the encounter. He extended one hand, palm up, toward the horse's muzzle. Shadowmere stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring as he caught the man's scent. For a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity, horse and man stood motionless, connected by whatever understanding had passed between them. Then, gently, Shadowmere allowed his nose to touch the stranger's palm. The crowd held its collective breath as the stranger slowly moved his hand to the horse's neck, stroking the sleek coat with obvious familiarity. Shadowmere not only tolerated the touch but seemed to welcome it, his eyes closing briefly as if savoring a sensation long missed. Without any apparent effort or struggle, the stranger slipped the halter over Shadowmere's head. The horse stood, quietly, occasionally turning to nuzzle the man's shoulder as if seeking reassurance. When his saddle was brought, Shadowmere accepted it without protest, standing still as the stranger checked the cinch and adjusted the stirrups. The mounting was the final test, the moment when even well-trained horses sometimes chose to assert their independence. But when the stranger swung into the saddle, Shadowmere merely snorted softly and stepped forward with fluid grace. Responding to the lightest touch of rein and heel, they moved together around the courtyard in perfect harmony, horse and rider, communicating through subtle shifts of weight and pressure that spoke of deep understanding. It was not the domination of beast by man, but a partnership between equals who had somehow found common ground. When they finally came to a halt before the assembled nobility, Shadowmere stood quietly, his earlier wildness completely gone. The stranger dismounted and handed the reins to a groom, then turned to face Lord Gareth and Eira. "The challenge is met, my lord," he said simply. "I claim the right to court your daughter, if she will have me." The courtyard erupted in cheers and applause, but Eira barely heard them. She was staring at the stranger, her betrothed. She realized with a mixture of shock and something that might have been excitement, trying to understand what she had just witnessed. The man had not conquered Shadowmere through force or trickery, but had somehow communicated with the grieving animal in a language she did not understand. As their eyes met across the courtyard, she saw something flicker in his gray gaze: triumph. Yes, but also uncertainty, as if he had surprised himself as much as everyone else. For a moment, she almost thought she saw fear there, the expression of a man who had won something he was not sure he deserved. Lord Gareth stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "The challenge has been met fairly and witnessed by all. Sir Knight, you have earned the right to my daughter's hand and my blessing. Let preparations begin for the wedding." As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about what they had witnessed, Eira remained motionless, watching as the stranger accepted congratulations from various lords with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the trial. She realized that in her desperate attempt to avoid an unwanted marriage, she had instead bound herself to a complete mystery, a man whose touch could gentle a savage horse, but whose name she did not even know. The great hall buzzed with speculation. Long after the evening feast had ended, nobles clustered in small groups, their voices low but their curiosity high as they discussed the mysterious knight who had accomplished the impossible. Eira moved through the conversations like a sleepwalker, accepting congratulations and well wishes, while her mind remained fixed on the man who had so effortlessly claimed her hand. He sat at the high table beside her father, eating little and speaking less. When addressed directly, he responded with polite brevity, but he volunteered nothing about his past, his holdings, or his intentions beyond the marriage that now bound them. His table manners marked him as nobility, but the calluses on his hands spoke of a life that included hard labor and weapon work. Most intriguingly, he wore a simple wooden cross on a leather cord around his neck, not the elaborate golden crucifixes favored by wealthy lords, but the kind of humble token carried by soldiers and pilgrims. He's quite handsome in a weathered sort of way. Lady Catherine of Millhaven whispered to Eira during a lull in the conversation. Those gray eyes are quite striking. You could have done much worse, my dear. Eira managed to smile, though inwardly. She wondered if she had done worse or better than she could have imagined. The stranger, her betrothed, was undeniably attractive, with the kind of mature masculine appeal that came from experience rather than youth. But his silence unnerved her. What manner of man can remain so composed when surrounded by curious nobility, all eager to know his story? When the formal portion of the evening finally ended, Eira excused herself and retreated to the solar, a smaller chamber where the ladies traditionally gathered for needlework and private conversation. Marin followed, along with several other young women who were clearly hoping for intimate details about the mysterious night. You must tell us everything, insisted Lady Margaret, Sir Marcus's sister, her eyes bright with curiosity. How did it feel to watch him tame that savage beast? Were you frightened? Excited? Did your heart race when you realized he had won your hand? Eira settled into a chair by the fire, grateful for its warmth. The evening had grown cool, and she felt chilled despite her heavy silk gown. I felt many things, she said carefully. Surprise, certainly. I had not expected anyone to succeed. But how did he do it? Pressed Lady Catherine. I've never seen anything like it. The horse was practically savage with the other men, but with him it was as gentle as a lamb. Does he have some special knowledge of horses? Is he perhaps from one of the great horse-breeding families? I don't know, Eira admitted, and the words tasted strange on her tongue. Tomorrow she would be formally betrothed to a man about whom she knew virtually nothing. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it stirred something that felt dangerously like excitement. How long had it been since anything in her carefully ordered life had been truly unpredictable? Marin, who had been unusually quiet during the evening's festivities, finally spoke. What will you do, my lady? Will you delay the wedding until you know more about him? Your father would understand if you asked for time. Eira considered this. She could indeed ask for a delay a few weeks to get to know her intended, to learn something of his background and character. It would be the prudent course, the one any sensible woman would choose. No, she said finally, I made a public challenge, and I will honor its outcome. If I begin making excuses and demanding delays, I will appear to be a woman who cannot keep her word. That would damage not only my reputation, but my father's as well. The other women exchanged glances. This was not the romantic excitement they had hoped to hear about, but they recognized the steel in Eira's voice that meant her mind was made up. Meanwhile, in the chamber that had been hastily prepared for the night, a different kind of contemplation was taking place. The room was comfortable, but not elaborate. A bed, a chair, a table, a washstand, and a small fireplace. It was the kind of accommodation typically given to visiting knights of modest but respectable standing, which seemed appropriate for a man who had won the challenge but revealed nothing of his wealth or holdings. The knight sat in the chair by the window, his wooden cross in his hands, his gray eyes fixed on something beyond the glass that only he could see. He had removed his outer garments, revealing a simple linen shirt that, like everything else about him, was well made but worn. Across his forearms, barely visible in the firelight, were the pale lines of old scars, the kind left by sword blades. That had come too close for comfort. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Enter, he called, rising from his chair to his surprise. It was Lord Gareth himself who stepped into the chamber, carrying a tray with wine and 2 cups. The lord of the castle moved with the careful dignity of a man who had learned to read the intentions of others through decades of political survival. I thought we might speak privately, Lord Gareth said, setting the tray on the small table. Tomorrow you will be formally betrothed to my daughter, yet I know nothing about you save that you can gentle a horse that no other man could touch. The knight accepted the offered cup of wine, but did not immediately drink. "What would you know, my lord? Your name, for a start. Your family. Your holdings. The usual things a father might wish to know about the man who will well wed his only child." "I am a knight," the stranger replied carefully. "I have served faithfully and with honor, though I am landless now. As for family, I have none living that would concern this union. My name—" He paused, as if weighing his words. "My name is Aldrich. I was born in the northern reaches of the kingdom, but I have traveled widely in service to various lords." It was not much information, but Lord Gareth was an experienced judge of men. He heard truth in the knight's words, even if that truth was incomplete. More importantly, he heard the careful control of a man who had learned to guard his tongue. "Sir Aldrich," Lord Gareth said, testing the name, "tell me, what brings a landless knight to attempt my daughter's challenge? Surely there are easier ways to win a bride, if that was your goal." Aldrich turned the wine cup in his hands, watching the liquid catch the firelight. "I heard of the challenge and felt called to attempt it. Sometimes a man finds himself in the right place at the right time, without fully understanding why fate has brought him there. You speak like a man who has seen much of the world. Have you served in the recent wars?" "I have served where duty called me," Aldrich replied. And Lord Gareth recognized the evasion of a professional soldier who had learned not to discuss past campaigns with civilians. "My daughter is strong-willed," Lord Gareth said, changing tactics. "She will not be an easy wife for a man who expects unquestioning obedience. Her mother was much the same brilliant, stubborn, fiercely protective of those she loved. Eira has grown up believing she should have some say in her own fate. I would not wish to marry a woman who had no will of her own," Aldrich said quietly. "A partnership requires two people of strength, not one strong person and one weak." This answer seemed to satisfy Lord Gareth more than all the previous responses combined. He nodded slowly, studying the younger man's face in the flickering firelight. "You gentle Shadowmere," he said finally. "That horse has been wild with grief since my wife's death." "What did you say to him?" Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old sorrow. "I told him that I understood loss, that I knew what it meant to have something precious taken away. Sometimes shared grief can be the beginning of healing." The simple honesty of the statement struck Lord Gareth deeply. Here, finally, was something real beneath the careful evasions, a glimpse of the pain that had shaped this mysterious night. "You have lost someone dear to you," Lord Gareth observed. "I have lost many someones," Aldrich replied. "It is the way of soldiers, my lord. We bury our comrades and carry on, because that is what honor demands." "And is honor what brought you to my daughter's challenge?" Aldrich met the older man's eyes directly for the first time. "Honor brought me to your lands, my lord. But what made me step forward today, I cannot say I fully understand it myself. Perhaps it was the look in her eyes when she made her declaration. She reminded me that there are still things in this world worth fighting for." Lord Gareth finished his wine and stood. "Tomorrow begins the formal betrothal period. 3 weeks is traditional, though it can be shortened if both parties are agreeable. You will have time to know each other, to see if this match will bring happiness as well as fulfillment of obligation. I am grateful for your wisdom, my lord. Treat her well, Sir Aldrich. She has been the light of this castle since her mother's death. If you prove worthy of her trust, you will find no more loyal companion in all the kingdom. But if you betray that trust—" He left the threat unfinished, but his meaning was clear. After Lord Gareth departed, Aldrich returned to his chair by the window. The castle was settling into sleep around him, the sounds of celebration fading into the comfortable quiet of night. In 3 weeks, he would marry a woman whose courage and spirit had drawn him from the shadows of guilt and self-imposed exile. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. He touched the wooden cross at his throat, remembering the dying words of the Lord who had given it to him. "Find peace, Aldrich. Find a way to live with what we have done." At the time, peace had seemed as impossible as happiness. But today, watching Lady Eira's green eyes flash with defiance and intelligence, he had felt something stir in his chest that might, in time, grow into both. The first week of betrothal passed in a careful dance of formal courtesy and curious observation. Eira found herself studying her intended husband during meals, walks in the garden, and the various entertainments arranged for their mutual benefit. Aldrich proved to be an attentive companion, offering his arm when the path was uneven, listening thoughtfully to her opinions on everything from castle management to the upcoming winter preparations, but revealing little of his own thoughts or feelings. It was during these stilted conversations that Eira began to notice small details that intrigued her. When discussing the training of young horses, Aldrich's reserved demeanor would crack slightly, revealing glimpses of genuine passion for the subject. He spoke knowledgeably about bloodlines and breeding, but more importantly, he talked about horses as individuals with distinct personalities and needs. When he mentioned a particular training technique for nervous colts, his hands would move unconsciously, as if remembering the feel of reins and the weight of a responsive mount. "You speak as though you've spent considerable time with horses," Eira observed one morning as they walked through the castle's herb garden. The late autumn air carried the scent of rosemary and the last stubborn mint, and fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet. A knight's relationship with his mount is often the difference between life and death, Aldrich replied carefully. "I have been fortunate to know some exceptional animals." It was another diplomatic non-answer, but Eira caught the past tense. Had been fortunate. What had happened to those exceptional horses? Had they died in battle, been sold from under him when he lost his lands, or simply left behind when circumstances forced him to travel light? She was contemplating how to phrase a more direct question when they encountered young Tom, one of the stable boys, limping badly as he carried a bucket of oats toward the horse stalls. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, but the kind of thin frame that spoke of too little food and too much hard work. "What happened to your leg, lad?" Aldrich asked, his voice gentle but authoritative in the way of men accustomed to command. Tom looked nervously between Eira and her betrothed, clearly uncertain whether he should speak freely. "Just a kick from one of the mares, sir. She's been skittish since her foal was weaned last month. Nothing serious." But Aldrich had already seen through the boy's brave dismissal. He knelt beside Tom, ignoring the mud that would stain his good boots, and examined the injured leg with practiced efficiency. "This happened more than a day ago," he said quietly. "The swelling suggests possible damage to the bone. Has anyone looked at this properly?" "The stable master said it would heal on its own, sir. Horses kick, and stable boys get kicked. It's the way of things." Eira watched with fascination as something shifted in Aldrich's expression. The careful politeness fell away, replaced by quiet authority and genuine concern. "The way of things," he repeated, "should not include young boys limping about on injuries that could cripple them if left untreated. Come." Without waiting for permission or protest, Aldrich lifted the boy onto his back and carried him toward the castle's infirmary. Tom's eyes went wide with shock. Noblemen simply did not carry stable boys, particularly not while dressed in their finest clothes. But Eira noticed that Aldrich's movements were sure and practiced, as if he had carried wounded comrades before. In the infirmary, Brother Marcus, the castle's healer, was initially reluctant to examine a mere stable boy until Aldrich's quiet but unmistakable command convinced him otherwise. The examination revealed a hairline fracture that would indeed have caused permanent damage if left untreated. "The boy will need to stay off the leg for at least 2 weeks," Brother Marcus pronounced, clearly uncomfortable with the attention being paid to such a minor member of the household. but I'm not sure the stable master will approve such an extended absence from work. The stable master will approve it because I will speak to him, Aldrich said calmly, and the boy's wages will continue during his recovery. A good worker deserves care when injured in service. As they left the infirmary, with Tom settled comfortably on a proper bed for the first time in his young life, Eira found herself seeing her betrothed in a new light. His kindness to the stable boy had been instinctive, unthinking, the response of a man who genuinely cared about the welfare of those under his protection. "That was well done," she said, as they resumed their walk. Aldrich seemed embarrassed by the praise. It was nothing. The boy needed help. Many men would have walked past without noticing his pain, or noticed and deemed it unworthy of their attention. Then they would be poor leaders and poorer men. Aldrich replied with quiet conviction. A commander who does not care for his people will find himself alone when he needs them most. Commander. The word had slipped out naturally, unconsciously, and Eira filed it away with the other small clues she was gathering about her mysterious intended. Not just a knight, then, but an officer. A man who had held responsibility for others and taken that duty seriously. That evening, she sought out Marin in her private chambers, where her friend was mending a torn sleeve by candlelight. Marin looked up with interest as Eira entered. The formal visiting schedule had left little time for private conversation between the two friends. "You look thoughtful," Marin observed, setting aside her needlework. "How goes the courtship with your mysterious knight?" Eira settled into the chair across from her friend, grateful for the chance to speak freely. "He is not what I expected." "In what way?" "He is kind. Genuinely kind. Not the calculated courtesy that passes for kindness among many nobles. Today he carried an injured stable boy to the infirmary and ensured his proper care. He spoke to the child as he would to anyone deserving of respect." Marin smiled. "And this troubles you?" "It intrigues me," Eira admitted. "But it also makes me more curious about what he is hiding." A landless knight with the bearing of a commander, the hands of a working soldier, and the natural authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He carries himself like nobility, but shows more concern for servants than most lords show for their own family members. "Perhaps," Marin suggested gently, "he is simply a good man who has fallen on hard times. Not every mystery has a dark secret at its heart." "Perhaps," Eira agreed, but something in her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. The next morning brought an unexpected opportunity for deeper insight. Eira rose early, intending to visit Shadowmere and see how the stallion was adjusting to his new tractability. The stables were quiet in the pre-dawn light, with only the soft sounds of horses moving in their stalls and the distant voice of someone, speaking in low, soothing tones. She followed the sound to Shadowmere's stall, where she found Aldrich grooming the great black horse with obvious skill and familiarity. Both man and animal seemed completely at ease, as if this morning ritual had been their custom for years rather than days. "You're early," Aldrich said without turning around, somehow having sensed her presence despite her careful approach. "I wanted to see him," Eira replied, moving closer to observe the pair. "I haven't visited the stable since since Mother died. It was too painful." Shadowmere turned his head toward her voice, and for a moment she held her breath, expecting the wild aggression that had marked his behavior for 5 years. Instead, the stallion nickered softly, a sound of recognition and welcome that brought tears to her eyes. "He remembers you," Aldrich said gently. "Animals grieve, but they also heal when they feel safe to do so." Eira reached tentatively toward the horse's neck, and Shadowmere allowed her touch, his skin warm and familiar beneath her fingers. "How did you know?" she whispered. "How did you know exactly what he needed?" Aldrich was quiet for a moment, his hands never ceasing their gentle work with the brush. "I recognized the look in his eyes. he said finally. I have seen it in my own mirror too many times. Sometimes healing requires someone who understands your particular kind of pain. The simple honesty of the statement took Eira's breath away. Here, finally, was the truth beneath all the careful evasions. Her betrothed was a man intimately acquainted with loss and grief. But instead of becoming bitter or cruel, he had developed the ability to recognize and heal that pain in others. What did you lose? She asked softly. Aldrich's hand stilled for just a moment. Everything that mattered, he said simply. But perhaps that is a conversation for another day, when we know each other better. It was still an evasion, but a gentler one, and Eira found herself respecting his need for privacy, even as her curiosity deepened. Instead of pressing further, she focused on the miracle before her, Shadowmere, calm and trusting, allowing both her and Aldrich to share in his presence as they worked together in comfortable silence. Grooming the horse that had been her mother's pride and joy, Eira felt something shift in her chest. For the first time since accepting the challenge, she began to think that her impulsive decision might lead to something more meaningful than mere political alliance. Around her neck, hidden beneath her modest mourning dress, hung her mother's locket, a simple gold pendant containing a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet and a lock of her father's hair from their early courtship. Eira had worn it every day since her mother's death, but she had never opened it in anyone else's presence. It was too personal, too precious, too vulnerable, a reminder of the love she feared she might never find. But watching Aldrich's gentle competence with her mother's beloved horse, seeing the quiet strength and genuine compassion that he tried so hard to hide, she found herself wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, she might have bound herself to a man capable of understanding the depth of feeling that the locket represented. The second week of betrothal brought an unexpected discovery. That would change everything Eira thought she knew about her intended husband. It began with what should have been a simple task, delivering fresh linens to Aldrich's chamber while he attended a morning meeting with her father about defensive preparations for the coming winter. Eira had volunteered for the task herself, partly to give the overworked servants a respite, but mostly because she hoped to learn something more about the man she would marry in less than 2 weeks. The chamber had been kept neat and spare, revealing little about its occupant beyond his preference for simplicity and order. It was while arranging the linens in the wooden chest that her fingers brushed against something unexpected, the corner of what felt like parchment, carefully tucked beneath the chest's false bottom. Her conscience war briefly with her curiosity, but curiosity won. After all, in 10 days, she would be bound to this man for life. Surely she had the right to know what secrets he kept. The parchment proved to be a detailed map, meticulously drawn and annotated in a careful hand. It showed the northern reaches of the kingdom and beyond, marking battle sites, supply routes, and strategic positions with the precision of a military cartographer. But it was the notations that made Eira's breath catch: dates, troop movements, and most significantly, a location circled in red ink with the words "Final Duty" written beside it in Aldrich's careful script. The map showed extensive travel across war zones, some dating back nearly 3 years. Eira traced the routes with her finger, seeing the story of a soldier's wanderings written in lines and symbols. But it was the red circle that commanded her attention, a small village in the far north, beyond the kingdom's borders, marked as if it held some special significance. Final Duty. What could that mean? And why would her betrothed have been planning to travel so far from civilized lands? The sound of footsteps in the corridor sent her scrambling to replace the map and finish her task. She had just managed to arrange the last of the linens when Aldrich appeared in the doorway, his steel-gray eyes taking in the scene with the quick assessment of a trained soldier. "Thank you," he said simply, but she caught the way his gaze flickered briefly toward the chest where the map lay hidden. Did he suspect she had found it? "It was no trouble," Eira replied, hoping her voice sounded more casual than she felt. "I enjoy keeping busy while the castle prepares for winter." They walked together to the great hall for the midday meal, but Eira found herself studying her betrothed with new eyes. The map had revealed him as a man with a destination, a purpose. That had brought him to Castle Ravenshollow, but would eventually take him away again. Was she merely a way station on his journey to that circled village in the north? The afternoon brought riding lessons, a suggestion Marin had made to give the betrothed couple time alone away from the castle's watchful eyes. Eira was an accomplished horsewoman, but Aldrich's instruction revealed techniques she had never learned, ways of communicating with her mount through subtle shifts of weight, and pressure that spoke of cavalry training at the highest level. "Where did you learn to ride like this?" she asked as they walked their horses through a meadow beyond the castle walls. The autumn afternoon was crisp and clear, with the kind of golden light that made even familiar landscapes look magical. "In service," Aldrich replied, his standard evasion, but this time Eira was prepared to press for more. "Service to whom? Which lord? In what wars?" Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "I served under Lord Commander Gareth Blackwood in the northern campaigns. Perhaps you have heard the name?" Eira's heart nearly stopped. Lord Commander Gareth Blackwood had been her uncle, her mother's beloved younger brother. He had died 3 years ago in a battle against raiders from beyond the kingdom's borders, and his death had begun the slow decline that eventually claimed her mother's life as well. "He was my uncle," she said quietly, watching Aldrich's face. For his reaction, the change in his expression was immediate and devastating. The careful control he maintained cracked completely, revealing a depth of anguish that took her breath away. His hands tightened on his reins, and his horse sensed the tension, dancing nervously beneath him. "Your uncle," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lady Isabel's brother. You knew my mother's name. I knew your uncle spoke of his sister constantly. He carried her portrait with him, alongside one of his niece, a green-eyed girl with spirit enough to tame dragons, he used to say." Aldrich's voice was thick with old grief. "He died in my arms, Eira. I was his second in command, responsible for the tactical decisions that led to that final battle." The revelation hit Eira like a physical blow. A betrothed, the man she had been slowly, carefully beginning to trust, had been present at the battle that destroyed her family. Worse, he had been in command, responsible for the decisions that cost her uncle his life and her mother her will to live. "Tell me," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "Tell me exactly what happened." Aldrich brought his horse to a halt, dismounting with the fluid grace of a practiced cavalryman. He stood with his back to her, shoulders rigid with tension, and began to speak in the flat, emotionless tone of a man delivering a military report. "We were pursuing a raiding party that had struck 3 villages in rapid succession. Intelligence suggested they were retreating to a stronghold beyond the northern border. Lord Commander Blackwood wanted to end the threat permanently, and I agreed with his assessment. We followed them into unfamiliar territory with insufficient scouting. Eira dismounted as well, moving to stand where she could see his face. The pain etched in his features was raw and immediate, as if the events had happened yesterday rather than 3 years ago. It was a trap, Aldrich continued. They had drawn us deliberately into terrain that favored their defensive position. When we realized our mistake, Lord Commander Blackwood ordered a retreat, but it was too late. The enemy had positioned archers in the high ground, and our cavalry was exposed in the valley below. How did he die? Leading the rear guard action that allowed the rest of us to escape. A crossbow bolt took him in the chest as he held the narrow pass that was our only route to safety. He lived long enough to pass command to me and to give me his final orders. Eira felt tears she had thought long shed burning behind her eyes. What orders? Aldrich finally turned to face her, his gray eyes bright with unshed tears of his own. To live with honor. To care for the families of those we lost. To find a way to make peace with what we had done. He reached inside his shirt and withdrew. The simple wooden cross she had noticed before. He gave me this, said it had belonged to his chaplain. He wanted me to carry it until I found my way back to the light. The wooden crossplane, humble, worn smooth by countless hands, suddenly took on profound significance. It was not just a religious symbol but a sacred trust, a dying man's final gift to the soldier who had failed to save him. You blame yourself, Eira said, understanding flooding through her. I was his second in command. The tactical assessment was mine as much as his. The decision to pursue was one I supported. The men who died, 43 good soldiers, died because of choices I helped make. And that is why you came here. Not to win a bride, but to fulfill some obligation to my uncle's memory. Aldrich nodded slowly. I heard of your challenge and recognized the name Ravenshollow. When I learned that Lord Gareth was Blackwood's brother-in-law, that you were his niece, I felt called to attempt it. I thought perhaps I could serve your family in some small way, make some gesture of reparation. The honesty was devastating. In its completeness, Eira felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, reframing everything she thought she understood about their betrothal. The gentle courtship, the careful attention, the kindness to servants and animals, all of it, had been motivated not by growing affection but by guilt and a sense of duty to the dead. So I am your penance, she said quietly. Your way of easing the burden of survivor's guilt. It began that way, Aldrich admitted, his voice breaking slightly. But Eira, what I feel for you now, that is real. These past 2 weeks, watching, your intelligence, your compassion, your strength, I have come to care for you deeply, more deeply than I thought possible. How can I believe that? She asked, pain making her voice sharp. How can I trust that any of this is real when it began as an act of contrition? Because, Aldrich said simply, I am telling you the truth. I could have kept the secret, married you without ever revealing my connection to your uncle's death. But I cannot build a marriage on deception, no matter how well-intentioned. Eira turned away from him, needing space to think, to process the magnitude of what she had learned. The man she had been falling in love with, and she could admit that now, in the face of losing him, was inextricably linked to the greatest tragedy of her life. Every kindness he had shown, every moment of connection they had shared, was tainted by the knowledge that he carried responsibility for her family's destruction. And yet, she found herself remembering his gentleness with Shadowmere, his instinctive care for young Tom, the way he spoke of her uncle with genuine love and respect rather than mere duty. Was it possible for a man to begin with guilt and grow into something truer? I need time, she said finally, not trusting herself to look at him. I need to think about what this means, what I can forgive, what I can live with. Of course, Aldrich replied. I will understand if you choose to break the betrothal. Your father would support such a decision under these circumstances. But even as the words hung in the air between them, Eira found herself reluctant to take that escape. The easy path would be to cry betrayal, to use his deception as grounds for ending an engagement that had never been her choice. Yet something held her back, perhaps the memory of her uncle's frequent letters about his trusted second-in-command, a young knight whose tactical brilliance was matched only by his devotion to his men. The village on your map, she said suddenly. The one circled in red. What is it? Aldrich's surprise at the question was evident. You found the map. I did. What is final duty? A village called Thornbrook, where the families of some of the men we lost have settled. I have been sending them what assistance I can, but I promised to visit them personally before. He stopped abruptly. Before what? Before I settled down to a new life. I wanted to look them in the eyes, to tell them how their sons and husbands died to ensure they were provided for. It seemed the least I could do. Eira felt some of her anger beginning to shift, not disappearing, but transforming into something more complex. Here was a man who had spent 3 years carrying guilt that was only partially his, sending aid to bereaved families, denying himself peace until he had discharged every obligation to the dead. It was noble and foolish and heartbreaking all at once. And after Thornbrook, what then? I don't know, Aldrich admitted. I had not planned beyond that final duty. I thought perhaps I would take vows, join a monastery, spend my remaining years in prayer and service. A waste, Eira said sharply, surprising them both with her vehemence. My uncle would not have wanted that for you. He would have wanted you to live, to find happiness, to use your skills in service to the living rather than endlessly mourning the dead. Aldrich stared at her, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. You speak as if you knew him. I did know him. He visited us, often before the northern campaigns began. He was full of life, full of laughter, completely devoted to his men but never willing to waste their lives unnecessarily. He would be furious to know that his death had driven you to consider taking monastic vows. Then, what would he want? Eira met his eyes directly, seeing the man beneath the guilt and self-recrimination. He would want you to honor the dead by living fully, by using your experience to protect others, by finding love and building a family, by being the leader he trained you to be. And you? Aldrich asked quietly. What do you want? It was the question she had been avoiding, even in her own thoughts. What did she want from a man whose presence in her life was both a gift and a torment? The great hall of Castle Ravenshollow had witnessed many momentous occasions in its long history, but few had carried the weight of the evening that followed Eira's discovery of Aldrich's true identity. The ancient sword of House Ravenshollow hung in its place of honor above the hearth, its blade reflecting the firelight like captured starlight. It was a weapon that had served her family for generations, present at every significant moment in their history. When Aldrich entered the hall for the evening meal, his eyes went immediately to the sword, and Eira saw something flicker across. His face recognition, perhaps, or memory. His step faltered almost imperceptibly, but she caught it, adding another piece to the puzzle of her betrothed's past. You know that blade, she said quietly as they took their places at the high table. I have seen it before, Aldrich admitted, his voice carefully neutral. Lord Commander Blackwood carried a sword of similar design. He said it was a family heirloom, forged by the same smith who made this one. The mention of her uncle's sword lost with him in that final battle brought a fresh wave of grief and anger. Everything about Aldrich seemed to connect back to that terrible day, as if fate had conspired to bind her to the very person whose failures had cost her everything she held. Dear Dot, yet as the evening progressed, Eira found herself watching him with new eyes. His interaction with the other nobles was polite but distant, as if he stood apart from their concerns about harvest yields and winter preparations. But when Lord Gareth began discussing the castle's defensive capabilities, Aldrich's demeanor changed completely. Gone was the careful deference of a landless knight seeking to make a good impression. In its place was the quiet authority of a man who had commanded troops in actual combat, who understood the deadly serious business of protecting people and property from those who would do them harm. The eastern wall could use reinforcement, Aldrich observed, his voice carrying the weight of professional expertise. Stone walls are strong, but they're only as effective as the men who defend them. Have you considered establishing watchtowers at the river bend? They would provide early warning of any approach from that direction. Lord Gareth leaned forward with interest. You have thoughts on defensive strategy? Some experience with it. Yes. In the northern campaigns, we learned that visibility and early warning were often more valuable than thick walls. A garrison that knows what it's facing can prepare accordingly. One that is surprised rarely fares well. As the conversation continued, Eira realized she was seeing a side of Aldrich that he had kept carefully hidden during their courtship. This was the second-in-command who had helped plan military campaigns, the tactical mind that her uncle had. Trusted with the lives of 43 men. Despite the tragic outcome of that final battle, there was no denying his competence, his deep understanding of warfare and strategy. "You speak from experience," Lord Gareth said. "Have you faced siege warfare yourself?" "I have," Aldrich replied simply. "Both as defender and attacker. Each has its own challenges, its own requirements for success." "And what would you recommend?" "For a castle like Ravenshollow?" Aldrich considered the question seriously, his gray eyes moving around the hall as if he were already envisioning potential threats and responses. "Your greatest strength is your position high ground, good sight. Lines, natural barriers on 3 sides. But your weakness is that you rely too heavily on the walls themselves. In modern warfare, walls can be breached given sufficient time and resources. Your real defense must be the ability to detect threats early and respond quickly." The conversation continued throughout the meal, with Aldrich offering insights that impressed even the most experienced of Lord Gareth's commanders. Eira listened with growing fascination and confusion. Here was the man her uncle had trusted, the officer whose tactical abilities had earned respect throughout the Northern Army. How could she reconcile this competent, insightful leader with the guilt-ridden penitent who had come to Ravenshollow seeking absolution? After the meal, she walked with him in the castle's gardens, needing privacy for the conversation that could no longer be avoided. The autumn air was crisp, and the first frost had touched the remaining flowers, silvering their petals in the moonlight. "You were different tonight," she said, as they followed the familiar paths between the herb beds and rosebush. "In what way?" "You were yourself. Not the careful, polite stranger who has been courting me for 2 weeks, but the officer my uncle wrote about in his letters. The tactical genius who could see 3 moves ahead of any enemy." Aldrich stopped walking, turning to face her in the pale light. "I did not want to presume. A lambless knight, even one with military experience, must be careful not to overstep his bounds when seeking to marry above his station." "Above your station?" Eira's voice carried a note of incredulity. "Aldrich, you were second in command to one of the kingdom's most respected military leaders. Your tactical knowledge could be invaluable to any lord wise enough to use it. You're not seeking charity. You're offering your skills in service to a family that should be honored to have them. Should be honored to have the man whose failures killed their beloved uncle?" The bitterness in his voice cut through her like a blade. Here was the heart of it, not false modesty or social climbing, but genuine self-loathing that had convinced him he deserved nothing better than exile and penance. "My uncle chose you as his second-in-command," Eira said firmly. "He was not a man to make such decisions lightly. He saw something in you that was worth his trust, worth the lives of his men. Are you suggesting his judgment was so poor that he would promote an incompetent fool to such a critical position?" Aldrich stared at her, clearly struggling with her logic. "He trusted me, and I failed him. You made a decision that had tragic consequences. That is not the same thing as failure born of incompetence or cowardice. War is uncertainty and risk, and sometimes even the best decisions lead to disaster. 43 men died because of choices I helped make. And how many lived because of other choices you made? How many battles were won? How many villages saved? How many families kept safe because of your tactical abilities?" Eira stepped closer, her voice growing more passionate. "You carry the weight of one failure and ignore years of success. That is not honor, Aldrich. That is self-indulgence." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Eira half expected him to turn away in anger or wounded pride. Instead, something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, at being confronted so directly by someone who claimed to understand his situation. "Your uncle would say the same thing," he said quietly. "He had little patience for self-pity, even when it was justified. Then perhaps you should listen to his memory instead of your guilt." They walked in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the small fountain at the center of the garden, Aldrich stopped and turned to face her directly. "Eira, I must ask you something, and I need your honest answer. Can you forgive me? Not the guilt I carry, not the mistakes I made, but me, the man who was present when your uncle died, who failed to save him, who carries responsibility for your mother's grief." It was the question she had been dreading, because the answer was complex and painful, and not at all what either of them wanted to hear. "I don't know," she said finally. "I want to. I can see the man my uncle trusted, the leader who inspired loyalty, the person who has spent 3 years trying to make amends for a failure that may not even have been entirely his fault. But I also see the face that was there when everything I loved began to fall apart." Aldrich nodded, accepting her honesty with the same dignity he had shown throughout their courtship. "Then perhaps we should end this betrothal now, before we both become trapped in something that brings more pain than joy." "Perhaps we should," Eira agreed, but her voice lacked conviction. The truth was that despite everything, the deception, the connection to her family's tragedy, the weight of guilt that shadowed his every action, she was not ready to let him go. Something about him called to her, some combination of strength and vulnerability that she had never encountered in another person. "But perhaps," she continued, "we should give ourselves more time. You have carried this guilt for 3 years, and I have just learned of it tonight. Neither of us is thinking clearly enough to make permanent decisions. What are you suggesting?" Eira looked up at the stars, visible through the bare branches of the garden's ancient oak trees. "I am suggesting that we proceed with the betrothal, but slowly. We learn to know each other not as guilty penitent and grieving family member, but as 2 people who might build something meaningful together. And if we cannot, if the weight of the past proves too heavy for any future to bear, then we will face that truth when we come to it. But Aldrich, if we are to have any chance at all, you must stop seeing yourself as nothing more than the man who failed my uncle. You must remember that you are also the man who gentled Shadowmere, who carried an injured stable boy to safety, who has spent 3 years caring for bereaved families at his own expense. You are not defined entirely by one terrible day." Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. "Your uncle used to say that a good leader learns as much from his failures as from his successes. Perhaps he would approve of what I have learned from mine. I think he would. And I think he would want you to use that knowledge in service to the living rather than in endless service to the dead." As they turned to walk back toward the castle, Eira felt something settle in her chest. Not resolution, exactly, but a kind of determined hope. The man beside her carried scars, both visible and hidden, but he also carried the strength to heal. From them, more importantly, he was learning to trust her enough to let her help carry the weight of his past. "There is something I want to show you," she said, as they approached the castle's main entrance. "Something I have not shared with anyone since my mother's death." Aldrich looked at her with curiosity and concern. "You need not share anything that brings you pain." "It brings me pain, yes, but also comfort. And I hope it might bring you comfort as well." She led him not to the great hall or the solar, but to her private chambers, where the fire burned low and the evening shadows gathered in the corners. From the small wooden chest beside her bed, she withdrew her mother's locket, the simple gold pendant she wore every day, but had never opened in another's presence. "My mother wore this from her wedding day until the day she died," Eira said, settling beside him in the chairs by the fire. "It contains a pressed flower from her bridal bouquet, and a lock of my father's hair from their early courtship, when love was new and untested by time and loss. She opened the locket with careful fingers, revealing the delicate flower still recognizable after all these years, and the dark strand of hair that had once belonged to a younger, less careworn Lord Gareth. She used to tell me that love was not just the passionate feeling of new romance, but the daily choice to nurture something precious, even when life tried to take it away. She said that true love was proven not in easy times, but in difficult ones, when choosing to stay and fight for each other required real courage. Aldrich studied the contents of the locket with the reverence they deserved. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, and she would have liked you, I think. She had little patience for men who mistook self-pity for nobility, but she would have admired your genuine desire to honor those you had lost, even knowing what that desire cost her own family. Eira closed the locket gently, but kept it in her hands rather than returning it to its usual place of concealment. She would have understood that your guilt, however misguided, came from love and loyalty, and she would have wanted you to find peace, not endless penance. How can you be so certain? Because she told me once that the greatest tragedy was not death itself, but the way death sometimes convinced the living to stop truly living. She said that the best way to honor someone's memory was to embrace the gifts they had given us and use them to build something beautiful. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the fire settle into glowing coals. Finally, Aldrich spoke, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been wonder. I had not expected this when I came to Castle Ravenshollow. I thought I was seeking a simple transaction service in exchange for absolution, duty in exchange for peace. But you have given me something far more precious, which is the possibility of a future worth living, the chance to honor the past without being imprisoned by it, the hope that love might indeed grow from unlikely beginnings into something real and lasting. Eira reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with the natural ease of two people who had learned to trust each other's touch. And you have given me the courage to risk my heart on something uncertain. For months, I was so afraid of making the wrong choice that I was refusing to make any choice at all. But watching you learn to see yourself clearly has taught me that the greatest risk is not in choosing imperfectly, but in refusing to choose at all. Then we are agreed? We move forward together, with full knowledge of each other's flaws and full commitment to building something worthy of the trust we are placing in each other. We are agreed, Eira confirmed, lifting their joined hands to press a gentle kiss to his knuckles. Though I reserve the right to remind you of this conversation if you ever again try to make decisions about our future without consulting me. Aldrich laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and completely free of the careful reserve that had marked so many of their earlier interactions. I would expect nothing less from the woman who chased me halfway across the kingdom to prevent me from making noble but foolish choices. As the evening deepened into night and they made their reluctant way to their separate chambers, propriety still demanded such arrangements until their wedding. Eira felt a profound sense of rightness about the path they had chosen. The journey ahead would not be easy, for love never was, but it would be honest and meaningful and built on the solid foundation of two people who had learned to see each other clearly and choose each other freely. The iron bracelet on her wrist, her father's gift that had once felt like a symbol of constraint, now seemed to represent something different. Not the chains that bound her to duty and expectation, but the strength that allowed her to forge her own destiny and protect what mattered most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to test the bonds they were building. But tonight she was content to rest in the certainty that she had found her partner in the dance of life. A man worthy of her trust and capable of matching her strength with his own. The third week of betrothal had brought an uneasy peace between Eira and Aldrich. They spoke more openly now, without the careful formality that had marked their early interactions. But a shadow remained between them. The weight of shared history that neither could entirely escape. Eira found herself studying his face during their conversations, searching for signs of the man her uncle had trusted, while Aldrich seemed to be learning to see himself through her eyes rather than through the lens of his own guilt. It was on a gray morning, with rain drumming against the castle walls and winter's approach evident in every gust of wind, that Eira made the discovery that would shatter what fragile understanding they had built. She had risen early, unable to sleep, and decided to seek solace in the castle's small chapel. The familiar ritual of prayer and reflection had always brought her comfort during times of uncertainty. But as she passed Aldrich's chamber on her way to the chapel, she heard sounds that made her pause, not the normal sounds of morning preparation, but something that suggested distress. A soft groan, followed by words spoken in what sounded like the delirium of fever or nightmare. Concerned despite her complicated feelings toward him, she knocked softly on the door. When there was no coherent response, only more muttered words that sounded like pleas or apologies, she pushed the door open slightly. Aldrich was in bed, but clearly in the grip of some vivid dream. His face was flushed, his dark hair damp with perspiration, and his hands clutched at the bedclothes as if trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. The words he spoke were fragmented but recognizable names, apologies, tactical, orders given too late to save anyone. Gareth, fall back. The archers. His voice broke off in a sound of anguish that made Eira's heart clench despite everything. She should have withdrawn, given him privacy in his torment, but something held her there. This was the man who had haunted her uncle's final battle, stripped of all pretense and careful control. In his dreams, she could see the officer who had watched good men die, who had carried the dying commander in his arms, who had spent 3 years reliving every decision that led to that tragic day. It was, as she turned to leave, convinced she had intruded on something too private to witness, that she saw the letter. It lay on his writing table, half hidden beneath other documents, but the blood-stained corner was visible and unmistakable. Her heart pounding, she moved closer. The parchment was old, the blood-stains brown with age, and the handwriting was one she recognized from years of correspondence. Her uncle's final letter, written in his own hand, bearing the official seal of his command. With trembling fingers, she lifted the document and began to read by the pale morning light filtering through the chamber's narrow window. To Sir Aldrich of Thornfield, my trusted second and friend, if you are reading this, then I am dead, and you have survived to carry out the final duties of command. Do not blame yourself for my death. It was my choice to lead the rear guard, my decision to hold the pass. You counseled caution, and I overruled you because I believed the risk was worth the potential gain. You were right, and I was wrong. But that is the burden of command, and not of those who serve it faithfully. I release you from service with honor and gratitude. You have been the finest officer I have ever known, a man of courage, wisdom, and unwavering loyalty. The failure that led to this disaster was mine alone, my pride, my refusal to listen to your tactical assessment, my determination to end the raiding threat regardless of cost. I have but one request. Do not waste your life in pursuit of penance you do not owe. Find a lord worthy of your service, a woman worthy of your heart, a life worthy of the man I have watched you become. The kingdom needs leaders like you among the living, not martyrs among the dead. Care for my men's families as I know you will. Remember me with affection, but not with guilt. And if you ever find yourself in the presence of my beloved sister Isabel or her daughter Eira, tell them that my final thoughts were of their love, and that I died defending something I believed worth defending. Your commander and friend, Lord Gareth Blackwood. The letter fell from Eira's nerveless fingers as the full magnitude of what she had just read crashed over her. Everything, absolutely everything, she thought she knew about her uncle's death was wrong. Aldrich had not been the reckless second-in-command whose tactical failures led to disaster. He had been the voice of caution, the prudent advisor whose warnings had been overruled by her uncle's determination to press the attack. More devastating still was the realization of what this meant about Aldrich himself. He had carried the burden of guilt for 3 years, not because he was responsible for her uncle's death, but because he had failed to prevent her uncle from making a fatal mistake. He had punished himself, denied himself peace and happiness, wandered the kingdom seeking absolution for a failure that existed only in his own tormented conscience. Behind her, Aldrich's nightmare continued, his voice broken with self-recrimination that now sounded not like the confession of a guilty man, but like the anguish of someone who had been forced to watch helplessly as disaster unfolded despite his best efforts to prevent it. "I tried to stop him," he murmured in his sleep. "Told him the terrain was wrong, the intelligence unreliable. He wouldn't listen, said it was worth the risk to end the threat permanently." Eira sank into the chair beside his bed, the blood-stained letter still clutched in her hands. The man she had been slowly learning to forgive was innocent of the crime for which he sought forgiveness. The guilt that had driven him to her door, that had motivated his gentle courtship and careful attention, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of his own role in the tragedy that had shaped both their lives. How could she tell him? How could she reveal that the burden he had carried for 3 years was not his to bear? And more importantly, how could she trust that his feelings for her were real when they had grown from such poisoned soil? The questions tormented her as she sat watching him struggle with demons that should never have been his to fight. When his nightmare finally broke and he woke, blinking in confusion at the pale morning light, he found her there beside his bed, her face streaked with tears. She was not aware of shedding. "Eira?" His voice was rough with sleep and residual distress. "What are you doing here? Are you well?" She held up the letter without speaking, watching as recognition dawned in his gray eyes. The color drained from his face as he realized what she had found, what she had read, what she now knew. "You lied to me," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of accusation and betrayal that made him flinch. Not about being there when he died, not about carrying responsibility for the decisions that led to that battle. "You lied about being at fault." Aldrich sat up slowly, his movements careful, as if he feared any sudden motion might shatter the fragile moment between them. "Eira, you counsel caution," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You warned him that the intelligence was unreliable, that the terrain favored the enemy. He overruled you because he was determined to end the threat permanently, and you followed orders because that is what good soldiers do. You are not responsible for his death. You tried to prevent it. I should have tried harder. I should have refused the order, taken command myself if necessary. Mutiny against a superior officer?" Eira's voice carried a note of incredulous anger. "Violated every oath you had taken, destroyed your honor and your career, all to save a man who had made a command decision you disagreed with. Is that what you think honor required?" Aldrich looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "He died because I failed to protect him. He died because he made a choice, the same choice you would have made in his position. The choice every good commander makes when they believe the mission is worth the risk. You said yourself that he led the rear guard action that saved the rest of your men. That was not the act of a man who regretted his decision, but of one who accepted its consequences." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she could look out at the rain-soaked courtyard below. "Do you know what this means, Aldrich? Do you understand what you have done? I have failed you as I failed him." "No," she said, turning back to face him with eyes that blazed with an emotion he could not identify. "You have wasted 3 years of your life, and mine, chasing absolution for a crime you never committed. Every kindness you have shown me, every moment of connection between us, has been tainted by guilt that was never yours to bear." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. "My feelings for you are real, Eira. Whatever brought me here, what I feel now is— How can I believe that? She interrupted. How can I trust anything you say when the very foundation of our relationship is built on your need to atone for something that was not your fault? You came here seeking my uncle's forgiveness through me, and I have been playing the role of absolution in your personal passion play. That is not it began that way, but it changed. You changed it. Your courage, your intelligence, your resemblance to the family you failed to save? The words came out more bitter than she had intended, but she was past caring about kindness. I look like my mother, Aldrich. I have her eyes, her spirit, her stubborn refusal to be controlled by the expectations of others. Is it any wonder you found yourself drawn to me? I must seem like the perfect opportunity for redemption, save the dead man's niece. Marry into his family, spend your life making amends. Aldrich rose from the bed, reaching toward her with a desperate gesture that she stepped away from. Eira, please, listen to me. Yes, guilt brought me here, but that is not what made me stay. That is not what made me fall in love with you. Love? She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. How can you call it love when you don't even know why you feel it? How can I trust emotions that grew from such corrupted ground? Because they are real, he said simply. Because when I watch you in the garden with the servants' children, when I see you defend the weak against the strong, when I hear you laugh at something unexpected in those moments, I forget about guilt and obligation and remember what it feels like to simply be alive. You are not your uncle's memory made flesh, Eira. You are yourself, and it is yourself I have come to love. She wanted to believe him. Standing there in the pale morning light, seeing the raw honesty in his face, she wanted desperately to believe that what had grown between them was real despite its tainted origins. The trust, once broken, could not be easily mended. I need time, she said finally. I need to understand what is real and what is simply the product of your need for redemption. And you need to learn to see yourself clearly to understand that the man I have been falling in love with is not a failure seeking absolution, but a good man who has been punishing himself for crimes he never committed. And if I can learn that, if I can separate my feelings for you from my guilt over the past— Eira met his eyes directly, seeing the hope and fear warring in their gray depths. Then perhaps we might find something worth building a life on. But Aldrich will not be your path to forgiveness. I will not be the prize you win for suffering sufficiently. If we are to have any future together, it must be as two people who choose each other freely, not as penance and absolution playing out their ancient dance. With that, she left him alone with his blood-stained letter and his shattered certainties, carrying with her the weight of a love that was both more and less than either of them had believed it to be. The days following Eira's discovery of the letter passed in a strange suspended tension, as if the entire castle held its breath waiting for some resolution that seemed impossible to achieve. Aldrich moved through his daily routines like a man sleepwalking, his careful composure intact, but somehow hollow. The revelation of his uncle's true words had shattered something fundamental in his understanding of himself, leaving him adrift in a world where the certainties that had guided him for 3 years no longer applied. Eira found herself avoiding him, not from anger, though anger was certainly part of what she felt, but from a need to understand her own heart without the complication of his presence. She spent long hours in the castle's library, a quiet sanctuary lined with volumes that had belonged to generations of her family. It was there, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, that she hoped to find some clarity about the choice that lay before her. The wedding was still scheduled for the end of the week. Preparations continued around her seamstresses, working on her gown, cooks planning the feast, musicians rehearsing the traditional songs. But the bride-to-be felt like a ghost haunting her own celebration, present in body but absent in spirit. It was Maren who finally forced the conversation that had been building like storm clouds on the horizon. "You cannot continue like this," her friend said firmly, entering the library where Eira sat staring unseeing at an open book of poetry. "You barely eat, you hardly sleep, and you look as though you are attending a funeral rather than preparing for your wedding." "Perhaps I am," Eira replied without looking up. "Perhaps I am mourning the death of something I thought was real, but was only ever an illusion." Maren settled into the chair across from her, her brown eyes reflecting the concern that had been growing for days. "Tell me what happened. And please, do not say it is nothing. I have known you since we were children, and I have never seen you like this." So Eira told her everything, the discovery of the map, the revelation of Aldrich's true identity, the blood-stained letter that had rewritten the entire story of her uncle's death. Maren listened without interruption, her expression shifting from surprise to understanding to something that looked like compassion. "He lied to you," Maren said when Eira had finished. "He lied to himself first," Eira replied. "I think he genuinely believed he was responsible, that his failure to prevent my uncle's decision made him complicit in the disaster that followed. But now you know the truth. Does that not change how you feel about him?" Eira closed the book and leaned back in her chair, finally meeting her friend's eyes. "That is the problem, Maren. I do not know how I feel about anything. Every emotion I thought I understood has been called into question. Was I falling in love with him, or with my own idea of who he was? Was his gentleness real, or was it the calculated behavior of a man seeking to win forgiveness? And now that I know he is not the failure he believed himself to be, how do I separate my feelings from the drama of revelation and redemption?" "Perhaps," Maren suggested gently, "you are thinking too much and feeling too little. Love is not a problem to be solved through logic, Eira. It is a recognition of something that exists beyond reason. But how can I trust what I feel when the foundation for those feelings was built on deception? Was it?" Maren challenged. "He may have been wrong about his guilt, but was he wrong about who he was? The man who gentled Shadowmere, who carried Tom to the infirmary, who speaks of your uncle with genuine love and respect, was that man a deception?" Eira considered this, remembering the moments when Aldrich's careful composure had cracked to reveal something deeper and truer. "No," she admitted, "that man was real. But so was the guilt that motivated his every action. How do I know which? Parts of him are genuine, and which are the product of 3 years of self-imposed penance?" "Perhaps," came a quiet voice from the doorway, "you could ask him." Both women turned to see Aldrich standing in the entrance to the library, his gray eyes reflecting an exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. He looked older somehow, as if the weight of carrying false guilt for 3 years had finally taken its toll. "Forgive me," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I did not mean to intrude, but I heard my name, and I think it is time we spoke honestly about what lies between us." Maren rose with the discretion of long friendship. "I will leave you to your conversation," she said, touching Eira's shoulder gently as she passed. "Remember what I said about thinking too much." When they were alone, Aldrich moved slowly into the room, his movements careful, as if he feared sudden motion might shatter the fragile possibility of communication. He did not sit, but stood near the window where the afternoon light revealed the lines of strain around his eyes. "I have spent the last 3 days reading and rereading Gareth's letter," he said without preamble, "trying to understand how I could have been so wrong about something so fundamental to who I believed myself to be. And what have you concluded? That guilt is a more powerful force than logic, and that a man can convince himself of almost anything if he needs absolution badly. Enough." He turned to face her directly. "I was so focused on the fact that I survived when he did not, that I lived while 43 good men died, that I transformed what should have been a soldier's grief into personal responsibility." "Why?" Eira asked. Why did you need it to be your fault? Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won self-knowledge. Because if it was my fault, then I could do something about it. I could seek forgiveness, make amends, earn my way back to worthiness. But if it was simply the random cruelty of war, the price of serving a commander who was brave enough to risk everything for what he believed was right, then there was nothing I could do except accept that good men sometimes die for reasons that have nothing to do with justice or desert, and accepting that was harder than carrying guilt you did not deserve. Much harder. Guilt gave me purpose, a quest, a way to transform meaningless loss into something that could be redeemed. Without it, I was just another survivor wondering why fate had spared him when it claimed better men. Eira rose from her chair and moved to stand near him, close enough to see the pain he had carried for so long etched in the lines of his face. And now? Now that you know the truth? Now I must learn to live without the certainty that guilt provided. I must find a way to honor the dead without dishonoring the living, including myself. He met her eyes with an honesty that took her breath away. And I must face the possibility that in trying to earn forgiveness I did not need, I may have lost the one thing that could have given my life real meaning, which is your love, your trust, the possibility of building something genuine with a woman who saw past my careful masks to the man underneath. His voice broke slightly. I came here seeking absolution, Eira, but I found something far more precious. The chance to be known completely by someone who could love me not in spite of my flaws, but because of my willingness to acknowledge them. Eira felt tears threatening, but she held them back through sheer force of will. This was too important for the luxury of easy emotion. But do you know the difference? She asked. Can you separate what you feel for me from what you thought you owed? My family? Can you love me as Eira, not as the niece of the man you failed to save? I believe I can, Aldrich said quietly. These past days, stripped of the certainties that brought me here, I have tried to examine every feeling, every moment, every reason I have for wanting to spend my life with you. And what I find when I strip away everything that has to do with guilt and obligation and the need for redemption is this. You make me want to be worthy of the man your uncle believed me to be. Not the man you think you should be to earn forgiveness, but the man you actually are? Yes, the man who can gentle a frightened horse because he understands fear. The man who carries injured children because he knows what it means to be helpless. The man who can love a woman like you because he has learned that strength and vulnerability are not opposites, but partners in the dance of a life fully lived. Eira felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of doubt and anger that had bound her heart since she found the letter. This was not the careful contrition of a man seeking absolution, but the raw honesty of someone who had finally learned to see himself clearly. There is something else, Aldrich continued, reaching inside his shirt to withdraw a small leather journal. I have kept a record of my journey since leaving the northern campaigns. I want you to read it not because I think it will change your mind about me, but because you deserve to know the truth about what brought me here and what I felt as it happened. Eira took the journal with trembling fingers. The leather was worn smooth by constant handling, and she could see that it had been his constant companion through months of travel and self-examination. I will read it, she promised. But Aldrich, I need you to understand something. If we are to have any future together, it cannot be built on the foundation of tragedy and guilt and the need for redemption. It must be built on the simple truth that two people have found something in each other that makes life richer and more meaningful. I understand. I want you to know that whether you choose to marry me or not, these weeks with you have taught me something invaluable. They have taught me that healing is possible, that love can grow in the most unlikely soil, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not in facing an enemy in battle, but in allowing yourself to be truly known. by another person. As he turned to leave, giving her privacy to read his journal and make her decision, Eira felt the first stirring of something that might have been hope. The man walking away from her was not the guilt-ridden penitent who had arrived at Castle Ravenshollow seeking absolution. This was someone who had learned to see himself honestly, to separate genuine feeling from the complicated web of obligation and self-recrimination that had driven him for so long. The journal in her hands felt warm, as if it still carried something of his presence. Whatever she found in its pages, she knew it would be the truth, not the careful presentation of a man seeking to win her hand, but the raw, unguarded thoughts of someone struggling to understand his own heart. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the first rumble of thunder could be heard in the distance. The wedding was 3 days away, and the bride still did not know if she would be walking toward a new beginning or the end of something that had never quite been real. But for the first time since finding that blood-stained letter, she felt ready to discover the answer. The journal lay open on Eira's table as the first light of dawn crept through her chamber windows. She had read through the night, following Aldrich's journey from the battlefields of the north to the gates of Castle Ravenshollow, watching his transformation from guilt-ridden survivor to a man slowly learning to live again. The entries began in despair, filled with self-recrimination and detailed accounts of his visits to the families of fallen soldiers. But as the months passed, a subtle change emerged in his words. The mechanical discharge of duty began to give way to genuine connection with the people he was trying to help. Widow Margaret, whose husband had saved 3 wounded comrades before falling himself. Young Peter, whose father had died holding a bridge long enough for civilians to escape. Each family had taught him something about grief, about resilience, about the ways people found to continue living after devastating loss. And then came the entries. About her. Day 847, heard tell of a challenge in Ravenshollow. The name stirred something in me. Gareth spoke often of his sister Isabel and her daughter. Could this be the same family? If so, perhaps fate offers me one final chance to serve his memory. Day 850. Arrived at Castle Ravenshollow today. The lady who made the challenge, she has her uncle's eyes, his stubborn pride, his refusal to accept easy answers. When she spoke of marrying only the man who could tame her mother's stallion, I heard in her voice the same fierce independence that Gareth admired in his sister. I find myself wondering if I have the right to attempt her challenge, knowing what I know about my role in her family's tragedy. Day 851. I approached the stallion today, not with any hope of success, but simply to understand what she was asking of her suitors. The horse is magnificent, black as midnight, proud as a king, and wounded in ways that go deeper than the eye can see. When I looked into his dark eyes, I saw my own grief reflected there. Perhaps that is why he allowed my touch. Grief recognizes grief, and neither of us is ready to surrender to it. Day 852. I cannot stop thinking about Lady Eira's laughter. It came after I said something about the autumn weather. Nothing witty or clever, but she laughed with such genuine pleasure that for a moment I forgot every reason I had for carrying guilt. Is this what healing sounds like? This music that makes a man remember what it feels like to be alive? The entries continued, chronicling his growing feelings with an honesty that made Eira's heart ache. He wrote about her kindness to servants, her intelligence in discussing castle management, her strength in facing an uncertain future. But more than that, he wrote about the way she made him want to be better, not to earn forgiveness, but simply to be worthy of her regard. Day 863. She asked me today about my knowledge of horses, and I found myself wanting to tell her everything about the campaigns, about the mounts I have loved and lost, about the way a good horse can save a man's life and break his heart in the same moment. But how can I speak of such things when every story leads back to that final battle, to the death that stands between us like a wall of shadows? Day 867. I am falling in love with her. The admission terrifies me because I know it changes nothing about why I came here, but it changes everything about why I want to stay. She deserves a husband who comes to her freely, not one driven by guilt and the need for absolution. How can I offer her a heart that is not entirely my own to give? The final entries, written in the days leading up to their confrontation, showed a man wrestling with the complexity of his own motivations. He wrote about loving her genuinely while acknowledging that love had grown from poisoned ground. He questioned every feeling, every impulse, trying to separate authentic emotion from the elaborate psychological dance of guilt and redemption he had been performing for 3 years. Day 871. Tomorrow I will ask Lord Gareth for her hand, and she will accept because she gave her word publicly. But what am I asking of her? To marry a man who loves her truly but came to her falsely? To build a life with someone who carries the shadow of her family's tragedy? I want to believe that love can overcome the circumstances of its birth, but I have no right to gamble with her happiness based on my hope. Eira closed the journal and leaned back in her chair, exhausted by the emotional journey she had just completed. The man revealed in these pages was neither the calculating deceiver she had briefly feared nor the guilt-ridden penitent he had believed himself to be. He was simply a human being struggling to understand his own heart, trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage of past trauma. The question that remained was whether she could do the same. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie. "Come," she called, expecting Marin with breakfast or news of wedding preparations. Instead, her father entered, his weathered face showing the strain of the past week's tensions. Lord Gareth had said little about the obvious difficulties in his daughter's betrothal, but his paternal concern was evident in every careful glance, every diplomatic silence. "You look tired, daughter," he said gently, settling into the chair across from her. The journal was enlightening? You knew he kept one? I suspected. A man who carries guilt as he does usually needs some way to organize his thoughts, to make sense of feelings that defy easy understanding. Lord Gareth's eyes moved to the leather-bound volume on her table. What did you learn? That he is a good man caught in the web of his own self-recrimination. That his feelings for me are real, even if they grew from complicated circumstances. That he has been trying to find his way back to the light ever since that terrible day when Uncle Gareth died. And you? What do you feel for him? It was the question Eira had been avoiding, even in her own thoughts. Easier to focus on Aldrich's motivations, his guilt, his journey towards self-understanding, than to examine her own heart with the same unflinching honesty. "I love him," she said finally, the admission surprising her with its certainty. Not the man I thought he was, not the idea of redemption and romance I had built around our courtship, but him, the person who carried Tom to the infirmary, who speaks to horses in the language of shared pain, who has spent 3 years trying to honor the dead while forgetting to care for the living. Then what troubles you? How can I trust a love that began in deception? How can I build a marriage on the foundation of his need for absolution, even if that need was misguided? Lord Gareth was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant with memory. When I married your mother, it was not for love. Oh, I was fond of her, and she was certainly beautiful, but it was an alliance political, practical, beneficial to both our houses. Love came later, slowly, built through shared experiences and mutual respect. But you were honest about your motivations from the beginning, were we? Your mother married me believing I was a romantic hero, a noble lord seeking her hand because he was enchanted by her beauty and spirit. In truth, I was a second son with limited prospects who saw marriage to her as a way to improve my station. She married an illusion as much as Aldrich asked you to marry one. Eira stared at her father, surprised by this revelation about her parents' legendary romance. But you were happy together. I remember how you looked at each other, how you laughed. Together, we built happiness together, despite the deceptions that brought us to the altar. Love, real love, is not about the circumstances of its beginning, but about the daily choice to nurture and protect it. Lord Gareth leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. The question is not whether Aldrich came to you under false pretenses, but whether he is capable of building something genuine with you now that the pretenses have been stripped away. And how can I know that? By making a choice, daughter. By deciding whether you trust him enough to take the risk that every marriage requires, the risk of believing that another person will choose to love you, not just today in the passion of new emotion, but tomorrow and next year and in all the ordinary moments when love becomes work as much as joy. Before Eira could respond, hurried footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of someone in considerable distress. Maren burst through the door without ceremony, her face flushed and her breathing labored as if she had been running. "My lady," she gasped. "Sir Aldrich, he is gone." "Gone?" Eira felt her heart skip a beat. "What do you mean, gone?" "His chamber is empty, his belongings packed and removed. The stable master says he took his horse before dawn, along with provisions for a long journey." Maren's eyes were bright with tears. "He left this for you." In her hands was her mother's silver ring, not an ornate wedding band, but a simple circle of precious metal that Lady Isabel had worn every day of her married life. Eira had given it to Aldrich during their betrothal ceremony as a token of her acceptance, and now he was returning it. Wrapped around the ring was a piece of parchment bearing a few lines in his careful handwriting. "Beloved Eira, I cannot ask you to build a life with a man who came to you under false pretenses, no matter how genuine his feelings became. You deserve better than the complications my past has brought to your future. The ring belongs with someone who can offer you an uncomplicated heart. I go north to complete my final duty to the families in Thornbrook, and then to find whatever peace awaits a man who has learned too late the difference between love and obligation. Remember me kindly, if you can." Aldrich Eira stared at the note, fury and heartbreak warring in her chest. After everything, after the journal, after his honest acknowledgement of his own confusion, after what had felt like the beginning of real understanding between them, he had simply fled rather than trust her to make her own choice about their future. "The coward," she whispered, then louder with growing anger. "The absolute coward. My lady?" Maren looked confused by her vehemence. "He makes the decision for both of us. He decides what I deserve, what I can accept, what risks I am willing to take, as if I'm some fragile flower who cannot be trusted to know her own mind." Eira stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists. 3 years he has been carrying guilt that was never his to bear, and now he compounds that error by deciding my fate without my consent. Lord Gareth watched his daughter pace the chamber, like a caged wolf, recognizing the fierce determination that had always marked her character. "What do you intend to do?" "I intend to go after him and drag him back to face the consequences of falling in love with a woman who will not be dismissed so easily." Eira's voice carried the ring of absolute conviction. "He may think he is protecting me by leaving, but he is simply trading one kind of pain for another. The northern roads are treacherous at this time of year," her father warned. "And if he does not wish to be found, then he should not have left a trail that Marcus the Tracker could follow in his sleep." Eira interrupted. "He is not fleeing from us, father. He's fulfilling his self-imposed obligations because he cannot conceive of happiness without first completing every last detail of his penance, which means I know exactly where he is going." Within the hour, preparations were underway for a pursuit that would have seemed impossible just days before. Eira had donned her riding clothes and armed herself with determination that brooked no argument from well-meaning advisers. Her escort would be small but capable men, who understood that their lady was not asking for permission, but announcing her intentions. As she mounted Shadowmare in the castle courtyard, the great stallion seemed to sense the urgency of their mission. He pranced beneath her, eager for the chase, as if he too understood that something precious was slipping away and must be reclaimed before it disappeared entirely. "Bring him home, daughter," Lord Gareth said, his hand briefly touching her boot in the stirrup. "Bring both of you home safely." "I will," she promised, gathering her reins with the confidence of someone who had finally stopped waiting for others to determine her fate. "Tell the wedding guests the celebration is postponed, not cancelled. When we return, there will be a feast worthy of the love we have fought so hard to claim." The afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the western mountains as they rode through the castle gates, following the clear trail that Aldrich had left in his steady progress northward. Eira felt no fear, only the fierce joy of finally taking action instead of merely reacting to the choices others made around. She was done being protected, done being spared difficult decisions, done accepting that others knew better than she did what would make her happy. The man she loved was riding toward what he believed was noble sacrifice, but she intended to show him that some things were worth fighting for, even when the battle required more courage than honor traditionally demanded. The chase had begun, and Lady Eira of Ravenshollow had no intention of losing the most important contest of her life, punishing himself for crimes he did not commit. And now he decides to punish us both by running away rather than fighting for something real. Lord Gareth watched his daughter's outburst with interest rather than alarm. "You sound like a woman who has made up her mind." "I have," Eira declared, her green eyes blazing with determination. "I will not let him disappear into the northern wilderness to play out some romantic tragedy of noble sacrifice. He may think he is sparing me pain, but he is simply exchanging one kind of hurt for another. What do you intend to do? Follow him, bring him back, make him face the choice he is trying to avoid." Maren looked alarmed. "My lady, the northern roads are dangerous, especially as winter approaches. Bandits, wild animals, harsh weather. Then, he should not have gone alone," Eira replied sharply. "If he can ride north to complete his self-imposed mission, then I can ride north to complete mine, which is saving the man I love from his own noble stupidity." Within the hour, Eira had changed into practical traveling clothes, leather breeches, woolen tunic, riding boots, and a heavy cloak lined with fur. Her father's objections to the journey had been overruled by his recognition that his daughter possessed the same stubborn determination that had characterized his late wife. If Eira had decided to pursue Aldrich, no amount of paternal authority would dissuade her. "Take an escort," he insisted as she prepared to depart. "At least 6 men, well armed and experienced with the northern roads." "2," Eira countered. "More than that will slow us down, and speed matters if we are to catch him before he reaches Thornbrook." They settled on 4, a compromise that satisfied neither of them but reflected the urgency of the situation. The men chosen were among the castle's best. Marcus the Tracker, who could follow a trail through stone. William and James, brothers, whose loyalty to the family was absolute. And Thomas, a grizzled veteran who had served with distinction in the northern campaigns and knew the terrain they would be crossing. As Eira mounted Shadowmare, for the great stallion would accept no other rider in Aldrich's absence, Maren approached with a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Food for the journey," she explained, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Bring him back, my lady. Bring both of you back safely." "I will," Eira promised, settling the bundle in her saddlebags alongside the supplies they had hastily assembled. "Tell everyone the wedding is postponed, not cancelled. When we return, there will be a celebration worthy of the wait." The afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon as they rode out through the castle gates. Eira felt a pang of anxiety as she looked back at the familiar walls, This might be the last time she saw her childhood home if her gamble failed. But the anxiety was overshadowed by determination and something that felt remarkably like joy. For the first time in weeks, she was taking action rather than simply reacting to the choices others made for her. Marcus had found Aldrich's trail easily enough. A single horse, heading north on the main road, making good time, but not pushing hard enough to suggest flight from pursuit. The tracker estimated they were perhaps 4 hours behind, a gap that could be closed if they rode hard and their quarry maintained his steady but unhurried pace. "He's not running from us," Marcus observed as they paused to rest the horses at a crossroads. If he wanted to disappear completely, he would have left the main road by now, taken one of the forest paths that would make tracking nearly impossible. "Then what is he doing?" Eira asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Following his conscience," Thomas replied with the insight of a man who had served under officers like Aldrich. "He made a promise to visit those families, and he will keep it regardless of what it costs him personally. It is the way of good soldiers, duty before desire, honor before happiness, even when the duty is self-imposed and the honor is misguided. Especially then, my lady. A man who carries guilt as he does will cling to any action that feels like righteousness, even when it serves no one's interests." They rode on as the afternoon faded into evening, following the increasingly faint trail through countryside that grew wilder and more remote with each mile. The trees pressed closer to the road, their bare branches creating a canopy that filtered the moonlight into shifting patterns of silver and shadow. This was border country, where the king's law held less sway and travelers learned to sleep lightly and keep their weapons close. It was near midnight when they caught their first glimpse of their quarry. A small fire flickered in a clearing beside the road, and beside it sat a solitary figure, a man wrapped in a dark cloak, staring into the flames as if seeking answers in their dancing light. Eira's heart clenched at the sight of him. Even at a distance, even in the uncertain firelight, she could see the weight of sorrow in his posture, the careful isolation of someone who believed he deserved to bear his burdens alone. "What are your orders, my lady?" William asked quietly. "Wait here," Eira replied, dismounting from Shadowmere with quiet grace. "If there is to be a confrontation, it should be between the two of us alone." She approached the camp slowly, making enough noise to announce her presence without seeming threatening. Aldrich looked up at her approach, and even in the firelight she could see his shock at her appearance. Eira. Her name was a whisper, as if he feared speaking it aloud might make her vanish like a dream. "What are you doing here?" "Preventing you from making the greatest mistake of your life," she replied, settling herself across the fire from him with the composure of a woman who had made a decision and intended to see it through. "You should not have come. The roads are dangerous, and the roads are dangerous," she agreed, "but not as dangerous as letting you disappear into the wilderness with your guilt and your noble intentions. We need to talk, Aldrich, and this time you are not going to run away before we finish the conversation." He stared at her across the flickering flames, his gray eyes reflecting a dozen emotions she could not quite read. "There is nothing to talk about. I have made my choice." "You have made a choice for both of us without consulting me about what I might want. That is not nobility, Aldrich. That is cowardice dressed up in pretty phrases about honor and sacrifice." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. "I am trying to spare you." "Spare me what?" "The choice of deciding for myself what risks I am willing to take. The opportunity to build something real with a man I love. Or are you trying to spare yourself the vulnerability of discovering whether that love is strong enough to overcome the circumstances of its beginning?" "You read the journal?" "I did. Every word, from beginning to end. I saw your journey from guilt-ridden survivor to a man slowly learning to live again. I saw the moment you stopped writing about obligation and started writing about love. And then I saw you flee rather than trust me to make my own choice about what that love might mean. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched in his lap as if holding on to something precious that threatened to slip away. You deserve better than the complications I bring to your life. That is my decision to make, not yours. Eira leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who would not be denied. For 3 years, you have punished yourself for crimes you did not commit. Now you want to punish us both by throwing away something real because it began in confusion and grew through difficulty. When will you stop letting guilt make your decisions for you? I love you, he said quietly, the admission torn from him like a confession. I love you so much that the thought of binding you to my failures terrifies me. Then fight for that love instead of running from it. Stay and discover whether what we have built together is strong enough to survive the truth about how it began. And if it is not, if the weight of the past proves too heavy for any future to bear? Eira rose and walked around the fire to kneel beside him, her hands covering his clenched fists. Then we will face that truth together, as partners should. But, Aldrich, we will never know what might have been possible if you do not give us the chance to find out. For a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity, they stared at each other in the firelight, balanced on the knife's edge between past and future, between fear and hope. Then, slowly, his hands relaxed under hers, and she saw something shift in his expression, the careful control giving way to raw vulnerability. I am afraid, he whispered. I am afraid that if I let myself believe in happiness, it will be torn away like everything else I have ever cared about. I know, she replied gently. So am I, but love always requires courage, and I would rather be afraid with you than safe without you. He reached up to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized she was shedding. Are you certain? Once we cross this threshold, there will be no going back to the safe distance of uncertainty. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. She leaned into his touch, drawing strength from the solid warmth of his presence. Marry me, Aldrich. Not because you owe a debt to my uncle's memory, not because you need absolution for imagined failures, but because we have found something in each other that makes life richer and more meaningful. Yes, he said, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of complete surrender to hope. Yes, I will marry you, and I will spend every day of our life together proving that love can indeed overcome the circumstances of its birth. Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid this moment might shatter if handled too roughly. But as they felt the solid reality of each other's presence, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of commitment and passion, and the kind of love that chooses to grow rather than simply exist. When they finally parted, Eira smiled with a joy that transformed her entire face. Now, about this journey to Thornbrook. You will not be completing it alone. Eira, it is not necessary for you to. We are partners now, she interrupted firmly. Your duties are my duties, your obligations are my obligations. If there are families to be visited and assurances to be given, then we will do it together. And then we will return home to a wedding that celebrates not just the union of two people, but the triumph of love over fear. Aldrich pulled her close, holding her against his chest as if she were the anchor that would keep him from drifting back into the darkness of self-recrimination. Have I told you that I love your stubborn refusal to accept easy answers? You have. Now, she replied, her voice muffled against his shoulder. And I love your willingness to carry burdens that are not yours to bear, even if I insist you learn to share them with me. As they sat together beside the dying fire, planning their continued journey to Thornbrook and their eventual return to Castle Ravenshollow, Eira felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was not the romance of fairy tales, where love conquered all obstacles through the simple power of good intentions. This was something deeper and more real, two people choosing to build something meaningful together despite the complications their histories brought to the relationship. Around her neck, hidden beneath her traveling clothes, her mother's locket seemed to warm against her skin, as if offering its blessing on a love that had learned to flourish not in spite of difficulty, but because of the strength that difficulty had taught them both. 6 months after their moonlit reconciliation in the northern wilderness, Castle Ravenshollow had transformed into something it had not been since Lady Isabel's death, a place of genuine happiness and hope. The great hall that had once echoed with political calculations and careful courtesies now rang with laughter and the easy conversation of people who felt secure in their bonds with one another. Eira stood at her favorite window in the solar, watching the morning training session in the courtyard below. Aldrich moved among the young knights and men-at-arms with the natural authority of someone born to command, offering corrections and encouragement in equal measure. His teaching methods were unlike those of the previous weapons masters, less focused on dominance and intimidation, more concerned with developing each student's individual strengths and addressing their particular weaknesses. "He has transformed them," Marin observed, joining her friend at the window. 6 months ago, they were adequate soldiers. Now they move like a real fighting unit, thinking as well as reacting. He needed to remember who he was before he could help others become who they might be, Eira replied, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on the slight curve of her belly where their first child grew. The gesture had become habitual in recent weeks, a protective instinct that spoke of new life and new hope. The pregnancy had been discovered just a month ago, bringing joy that had seemed to illuminate the entire castle. Lord Gareth had embraced his son-in-law with tears in his eyes, speaking of grandchildren and the continuation of family lines. But more than that, the news had represented the final laying to rest of old grief and the full embrace of a future built on love rather than duty. Their journey to Thornbrook had taken 2 weeks and had proven to be the healing both of them needed. The families Aldrich had been supporting were indeed grateful for his care, but they were more relieved to see him find peace than they were concerned with the particular details of their husbands' and sons' deaths. Widow Margaret had taken one look at Eira and declared that any woman who would chase a fool man halfway across the kingdom was exactly what he needed to keep him from drowning in unnecessary guilt. Young Peter, now 16 and apprentice to the village blacksmith, had listened to Aldrich's carefully prepared speech about duty and honor and responsibility, then interrupted to ask if he was planning to spend the rest of his life apologizing for surviving when better men died. The question, asked with the blunt honesty of youth, had shattered the last of Aldrich's elaborate justifications for his guilt and forced him to confront the simple truth that he was alive, that life was a gift not to be wasted in endless penance, and that the best way to honor the dead was to live fully and well. "My lady?" A young page appeared at the solar door, his face flushed with the importance of his message. "Sir Aldrich requests your presence in the great hall. He says there is something you need to see." Eira exchanged a curious glance with Marin, then made her way through the familiar corridors to the hall, where she had first watched Aldrich Gentle Shadowmere all those months ago. She found him standing before the great hearth, but he was not alone. Beside him stood a man she recognized from descriptions in his journal, Captain Robber of Westmark, one of the surviving officers from that final battle in the north. "Robert," Aldrich was saying as she approached, "I want you to meet my wife, Lady Eira. Eira, this is the man who carried me to safety when I was wounded trying to reach your uncle." Captain Robert bowed respectfully, but his weathered face carried the kind of expression that suggested he had not come simply to pay social calls. "My lady, it is an honor. Your husband speaks of you constantly in his letters." "Letters?" Eira looked between the two men, sensing undercurrents she did not fully understand. "I have been corresponding with the surviving officers from our unit," Aldrich explained, "sharing what I learned during my journey, encouraging them to find ways to Honor our dead comrades without sacrificing their own futures. Robert has news I thought you should hear. Captain Robert shifted uncomfortably, as if the words he needed to speak were difficult ones. My lady, there has been a development regarding the battle where Lord Commander Blackwood fell. New information has come to light that changes our understanding of what happened that day. Eira felt a chill of apprehension. What kind of information? A survivor from the enemy force has been captured. A man wounded so badly in the battle that he was left for dead by his own comrades. He has spent the past 3 years as a hermit in the northern mountains. But when he learned of the identity of the commander we lost, he felt compelled to set the record straight. I don't understand, Eira said, though she was beginning to fear that she did. The raid on those 3 villages, it was not a random attack by bandits or raiders from beyond the border. It was a deliberate provocation, designed to draw our forces into pursuit. The enemy knew exactly which commander would respond and how. He would respond. They studied Lord Commander Blackwood's previous campaigns, his tactical preferences, his sense of honor and duty. Aldrich's face had gone very pale. They were specifically targeting Gareth. Yes, sir, and they knew he would never allow civilian casualties to go unanswered. Knew he would pursue them regardless of the strategic risks. The whole campaign was designed to eliminate him personally, because his tactical innovations were beginning to turn the tide in our favor along the northern border. The revelation hit Eira like a physical blow. Her uncle had not died because of tactical miscalculations or acceptable risks taken in pursuit of military objectives. He had died because enemies who could not defeat him in fair battle had chosen to murder him through treachery and misdirection. The pass where he made his final stand, she said quietly. They knew he would be forced to retreat through it. They counted on it, my lady. They positioned their archers specifically to target the officer leading the rear guard, knowing that Lord Commander Blackwood would never ask another man to take a risk he would not take himself. It was an assassination, Aldrich said, his voice hollow with the implications. Everything that followed, the pursuit, the trap, the final battle, it was all orchestrated to kill one man. And everyone who died with him was simply considered acceptable collateral damage in achieving that goal. Captain Robert's voice carried the anger of a professional soldier confronting dishonorable tactics. The survivor wanted this known because, he said, Lord Commander Blackwood died like a hero. But the men who planned his death were cowards who could not face him in honest combat. Eira sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was hearing. All of Aldrich's guilt, all of his self-recrimination, all of the carefully constructed narratives about tactical failures and acceptable risks. None of it had been real. Her uncle had died not because of military miscalculation, but because of enemy treachery that no amount of careful planning could have anticipated or prevented. This changes everything, she whispered. It changes nothing, Aldrich said firmly, surprising both her and Captain Robert with his certainty. Gareth is still dead. 43 good men are still dead. The families they left behind still need care and support. The only thing that changes is my understanding of why it happened, and I learned months ago that the why matters less than how we choose to live with the consequences. Eira looked up at her husband with new admiration. The man who had spent 3 years torturing himself with guilt would once have seized on this information as complete vindication, proof that his suffering had been unnecessary. But the man he had become through their journey together understood that healing did not depend on external validation, but on internal choice. However, he continued, his voice taking on the authority of command, this information must be shared with the families of those we lost. They deserve to know that their husbands and sons died not because of tactical failure, but because they served under a commander so skilled and honorable that enemies resorted to treachery to eliminate him. I have been visiting the families, sir, sharing this information with each of them personally. Most have responded as you might expect, grief mixed with pride, that their men died in service to such a worthy leader. And they should be proud, Eira said, rising from her chair with sudden determination. Captain Robert, I want you to carry a message from me to each of those families. Tell them that Castle Ravenshollow will always be open to them, that they are welcome here for as long as they choose to stay. Tell them that the niece of Lord Commander Blackwood considers them family, bound to us by shared loss and shared honor. Captain Robert bowed deeply. It would be my privilege, my lady. As they concluded their conversation, and Captain Robert prepared to continue his journey to the remaining families, Eira found herself reflecting on the strange paths that had brought them all to this moment. The revelation of enemy treachery was important, but it was not the source of her peace or happiness. That had come from the harder work of learning to build something meaningful despite uncertainty, to choose love despite risk, to trust in the possibility of healing even when the wounds seemed too deep to mend. That evening, as she and Aldrich walked through the castle gardens where they had once argued about guilt and forgiveness, she felt the profound satisfaction of a life lived honestly and fully. The pregnancy was beginning to show now, and Aldrich's protective attention had become both endearing and occasionally exasperating. You realize, she said, as they paused beside the fountain where he had first asked if she could forgive him, that our child will grow up hearing stories about how his parents met. What will we tell him about the challenge and the stallion and the mysterious knight who won his mother's hand? We will tell him the truth, Aldrich replied, his arm tightening around her waist, that sometimes love grows in unlikely soil, that good things can emerge from difficult circumstances, and that the courage to choose happiness is often more heroic than the willingness to embrace suffering. And if he asks about your guilt, about the years you spent carrying burdens that were not yours to bear, we will tell him that guilt can be a teacher if we let it show us how to live better, but that it becomes a prison if we mistake punishment for growth. Aldrich paused, his voice growing thoughtful. And we will tell him that his mother saved his father from that prison by refusing to let him disappear into noble self-sacrifice. Above them, a new banner flew from the castle's highest tower, not replacing the traditional heraldry of House Ravenshollow, but joining it in a display that spoke of unity and new beginnings. The banner combined elements from both their histories. The silver wolf of her family alongside the oak tree that had been the symbol of his original house, before war and loss had left him landless and searching for purpose as autumn deepened into winter and the first snows began to dust the castle walls. Eira often found herself thinking about the challenge that had started it all. She had intended to avoid an unwanted marriage by creating an impossible task, but instead she had discovered that the impossible sometimes happened not through force or trickery, but through the simple willingness to recognize kinship and shared pain and hope and mutual understanding. Shadowmere had accepted Aldrich's touch because both horse and man understood loss and loneliness. Their own love had grown for similar reasons, nurtured by the recognition that healing was possible even when it seemed that too much had been broken to mend. The child she carried would be born into a world where such healing was not just possible, but expected, where love was understood to be not a reward for perfection, but a choice made daily by imperfect people committed to growing together. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of world her uncle would have wanted to see, a place where honor was measured not by the absence of failure, but by the courage to continue building something meaningful despite the inevitable wounds that life inflicted on all who dared to live fully in the spring. Their son would be born, carrying forward the legacy of both their houses and the story of how love had triumphed not through perfection, but through persistence, not through the absence of struggle, but through the willingness to struggle together, toward something better than either could achieve alone. And someday, when he was old enough to understand, they would take him to the stables to meet Shadowmere, and they would tell him the story of how a challenge born of desperation became the foundation for a love that proved worthy of the trust they had placed in each other.